Well, hello again. It's really nice to be with you today to have a discussion about some more logical fallacies. And today we're going to talk about fallacies of presumption, ambiguity, and grammatical analogy. Fallacies of presumption are fallacies that are based upon a certain assumption that the arguer makes that she is really not entitled to make. And perhaps the most significant or common one of these fallacies is called begging the question. When an arguer begs the question, she assumes the very thing that she's supposed to be proving. And this can sometimes be tricky, because if you're not paying attention, you might think that she actually proved her point. In fact, she made an assumption that was not justified, and based upon that assumption, it looks as though the conclusion follows. And there are three basic ways of begging the question. The first is to leave out a key and controversial premise. So the argument looks like it works at first glance because the most important premise has been left out. For example, you should never believe anything without good evidence. Therefore, you should not believe in God. All right, so the arguer says, you should never believe anything without good evidence. Therefore, you should never believe in God. But there's a missing premise here. There's an assumption that the arguer is making. And the assumption is that there is no good evidence for believing in God, or that believing in God is irrational in some way. And that is the very issue that really should be discussed, right? So the very heart of the matter is ignored when a person begs the question. They leave out a key controversial premise. In this case, you should never believe anything without good evidence, therefore you should not believe in God. The missing premise is that there is no good evidence for believing in God. Well, that is the sort of thing that we should discuss and argue about. And actually tons of books on both sides of that issue have been written and are well worth reading. All right, another example. Murderers should be put to death. Therefore, abortionists should be put to death. All right, this argument begs a very important question. It assumes that abortionists are murderers, or that abortion constitutes murder. Well, that's the very issue at stake in our country and many other countries where abortion is controversial. So if you say murderers should be put to death, therefore abortionists should be put to death, you're completely avoiding discussion of the really difficult issue. And the difficult issue is, what is murder, and does abortion constitute murder? Does the fetus have a right to life? What is the metaphysical status of the fetus? Is it a person or not? Those are all the tough questions. This arguer does not want to get into the tough questions. Instead, he or she just wants to, in a very quick way, sort of impress upon us that there's something wrong that with abortion, and that abortionists should be put to death. Right? So, murderers should be put to death, therefore abortionists should be put to death. If it seems plausible at all, it's only because the arguer has left out the key premise, which is that abortion is murder. Well, that's the very thing. That's the very meaty issue that we need to discuss. And so that's what's typical of the form of begging the question, where you leave out a key premise. The very thing to be discussed is removed, is a missing key premise, and that premise is controversial. Right? Now, anytime you look at an argument and say, oh, that argument begs the question because it leaves out a key premise, you should be able to identify the premise that's been left out, and that's what I just did with these two cases. Another form of begging the question is where we just restate a questionable premise as a conclusion. Right? So sometimes the conclusion is really just sort of a cleverly restated version of the premise. So I might say something like this: Roethlisberger is definitely going to have an amazing year this year, because everything he does will be simply astounding and unbelievable. Well, I use the word because here, but really that conclusion is just a slightly reworded version of the premise. And so I'm restating a questionable premise as a conclusion. And that's another form of begging the question. The final form of begging the question, which we sometimes encounter, is called arguing in a circle. Right? Now, arguing in a circle happens when a person uses a premise that they use the conclusion in the argument. Right? So they're arguing in a circle because the conclusion is actually being used in the argument. If the argument's long enough, you might not notice it. So, for instance, someone might argue that Obama is wise and good. Right? Why do you think Obama is wise and good? Well, all his policies are just, and we know his policies are just because they issue from wise advisors. How do you know that those advisors are wise? Because Obama chose him and he is wise and good. Right? Well, the idea that Obama is wise and good is the very thing that was supposed to be proven. The evidence given for that is that his policies are just, and the reason given for thinking his policies are just is that they come from wise advisors. The only reason given for thinking his advisors are wise is because Obama chose them, and he is wise. Well, that was the very thing to be proven. So sometimes you get this sort of circular kind of argument. And it happens sometimes when the arguer has written a long paragraph or treatise, and they themselves might not even realize that they are using the conclusion as a premise for that conclusion. All right, so all forms of begging the question are such that the arguer assumes the very thing that she's supposed to be proving. And this can happen by leaving out a key premise, by repeating a questionable premise as the conclusion, or by arguing in a circle in which you use the conclusion as one of the premises in the argument. The next kind of fallacy of presumption is a complex question. The complex question fallacy happens when a question is asked that assumes something that the responder would deny or would not accept. And the complex question is put together in such a way that you cannot give a simple answer to it. You can't give a simple yes or no or some other sort of simple answer. And that's because two separate questions have been combined into one. And the tricky thing about the complex question is it often makes it appear as though the responder agrees with something that she would categorically deny. And if you watch out for it, you will see complex question used in courtrooms and in political debates all the time. I first encountered the complex question when I was a kid. I was in elementary school. I was waiting in line for the lunchroom, and a kid turns to me, he was bored, and he said, "Are you a monkey in a cage?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Monkey on the loose, monkey on the loose." All right, so either way I answered that question, I was going to be saddled with some fact about myself that I would not endorse, namely that I'm a monkey, right? He says, "Are you a monkey in a cage?" And if I say yes, it's like, "Oh, Andy's a monkey in a cage, ha ha ha." If I say no, and he says, "Monkey on the loose, monkey on the loose," Andy's a monkey on the loose. Either way, I have subtly endorsed the fact that I'm a monkey, and I was not a monkey, and have never been one. Now, why does this work? Because there are two questions combined into one. The questions are you a monkey? And are you in a cage? Right? The best way to respond to that is, okay, kid, first of all, I'm not a monkey, and secondly, I'm not in a cage. If you try to say that, he'll say, "You have to say yes or no, you have to say yes or no." Well, the gig is up at that point. This person did not trust you to be wise about the complex question fallacy. If you break it into two questions, then they can't do this to you. So with all complex question fallacies, you should be able to identify the two questions that have been combined into one. And of course, as I just mentioned, the best way to respond to this sort of trickery is to separate the question back out into the two original questions and answer each separately.